I'm delighted that you braved the weather and that you came out to this event here at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, at which we will commemorate the 20th anniversary of this important book, Religion, The Missing Dimension of Statecraft. Many of you know that Douglas Johnston, our speaker tonight, has made an impact in multiple sectors, in the nonprofit world and in the NGO world, at Harvard University. He spent time as a Navy commander, and he's now leads the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy that he founded. And the work there is very, very fascinating. If you follow them, for instance, work bringing science textbooks into madrasas in Pakistan. This is someone who is a thinker, but he's also a doer. And his influence has gone throughout federal agencies as well. I saw that some of you, based on your email affiliations, are from USAID and from the State Department. And I can tell you that the things that he's been championing since this book in 1994 have become parts of the ways that at least some sectors of those agencies think about engaging the multidimensionality of religion around the world today. Last night, I was looking at a brand new book. It's called Military Chaplains in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Beyond. It has a great author, Eric Patterson. It's an edited volume, and 8 of the chapters are by military chaplains. And of those 8, I double-checked, there are 17 references to Doug Johnston. That's why I bring it up. 6 of the 8 U.S. military chaplains in the book directly cite his involvement in their lives, in their curriculum, as having an impact on the way that they think about peace building and security today. And so, Doug, I congratulate you on that. I don't think you knew that. The book came out 6 weeks ago. But the chaplain Corps is just one sector of the government that you've had an impact on. Well, this book was Doug's book, Religion, The Missing Dimension of Statecraft, was the first of 3 books. It was followed later by a book that had a provocative subtitle about trumping realpolitik through religious diplomacy. And then his 3rd book that came out 2 years ago, Religion, Terror, and Error, is a fascinating study. It won a 1st place in the religion category and a 3rd place in the political science category from Forward Reviews, which reviews academic books. And it's an argument about how the West and how Muslim societies misperceive one another and how they can overcome that. And so I would recommend those books to you as well. Well, I asked Doug this. Doug, would you give us a retrospect on some of the things that have happened in the past 20 years? But would you also do this for us tonight? Would you, before we take Q&A a bit later, would you say something about what's ahead? What's the prospect? In 2014, as we think about the next 20 years, is religion still the missing dimension of statecraft? Ladies and gentlemen, will you help me welcome Dr. Douglas Johnston?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Berkley Center and to Georgetown University more generally, and to all of you for honoring us with your presence. It really is an honor, and I must say that I don't quite know what to do because I've never been to nor even heard of such an event like this, celebrating the anniversary of a book. I will say this, I'm going to speak about the book immodestly because it's a tribute to the contributions of a number of world-class scholars and practitioners. It's not about me. It's about a group of very like-minded folks. Basically, I thought what might be interesting to you is to sort of review for you how this whole thing came about. And it happened when I was teaching up at the Kennedy School. I was teaching a course in international security at the time, and I was thinking that, you know, here we and the Soviets were spending trillions of dollars and rubles on weapons systems, the sole purpose for which is they not be used because we're enhancing deterrence, while half the rest of the world starves to death. And then wearing that same hat, a security hat, I thought, well, you know, the United States is probably second to none in the world in its ability to mount a strong defense to keep the peace, but I thought we were woefully inept at making peace. And that I shifted then to another hat. I'd been involved with the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington for quite some time, and I had seen how individuals operating on the basis of their personal religious faith were able to reconcile differences between peoples, between factions, sometimes bringing wars to a halt with no one the wiser for how it had taken place. And I thought maybe if I could capture this kind of activity in a compelling way and make it known to policymakers and diplomats, there might be opportunities for government to build upon it, to reinforce it and to build upon it. Never try to own it because it would discredit it with the political agenda, but to create a synergy for peacemaking that didn't otherwise exist. And so that was the thought. And it took until 1987 until I was in a position to really be able to act on it, because shortly after having that thought, I went into the private sector. And then in '87, I was being hired to be number 2 at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And that meant I was the chief operating officer in addition to being the executive vice president. And when they were hiring me for less money than I was making at the time. So I cut a deal. And the deal was, even though the entire center theoretically reported to me, there was one project I wanted to do out of my own office. And that was to explore the positive role that religious or spiritual factors could play in actually preventing or resolving conflict, while at the same time advancing social change based on justice and reconciliation. Well, it didn't cost them anything, so they said sure. And I was very mindful of the conservative donor base of the center, though, so I didn't come totally out of the closet. I called the project Religion and Conflict. And for the first 3 years, I could not raise any funds at all to speak of. So finally, history caught up with us, and the Berlin Wall came down in '89, and the role of the churches had been very apparent in that, particularly the Pope. So then we had 5 foundations that came in with funding, and we ended up getting $354,000 to develop this book. And we needed all of that, because what we were trying to capture was the spiritual dimension at play in some of these conflicts out there that had actually made a difference. And that's a very elusive sort of thing to seek after. It requires putting really top talented PhD types out in the field for extended periods of time to really track it down. And that was one of the things I learned after I got there and started to pursue this project in addition to all else I was doing. Quickly became apparent to me that whenever you're talking about the cross-section between religion and politics, it gets very complicated very quickly. And I quickly surmised that it was beyond the capacity of any one person that I knew to be able to pull that off, least of all me. And by the way, Eric, it was first in political science and third in religion, because I've never had a course in religion in my life. And so that was one of the other interesting things about this, is that when we get to forming the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, it's based on, if this book hadn't met with such acclaim, our center would never have come into being, and I think a lot of other things that have taken place would not have happened. But we built the whole book around 7 case studies, and these originally thought that we would find case studies in all religions, and we actively looked hard. And just sort of by default, I think the peacemaking mandate in Christianity is a bit more apparent than in some other religions. And doesn't mean they're not out there, we just didn't find them. And so these are the ones we came up with, these 7. And you can see to the right who the authors were. Now at the top there you've got Edward Luttwak, who couldn't be here, he's in Japan right now, but Ed's probably one of the smartest men in the entire world. And one of the things that I was so taken with was when we got further downstream, we used to have monthly lunches and really discuss things in detail and go deep. And Ed would come away from, at least several occasions, he commented that those were the most intellectually stimulating conversations he'd ever had. And that's quite something from him. He's probably the best strategic thinker in the world in terms of authoring scholastic masterpieces. And then Cynthia Sampson. Cynthia was, she ended up being co-editor with me, but she had been a writer for the Christian Science Monitor very able, and I got her on board to help coordinate the research for all of this, and it's quite a lot to coordinate, as I might say. David Steele is here with us today, and he did a great job on Germany. Henry Wooster is now in the White House. The NSC, he's in charge of Central Asia for the National Security Council. And then I think that's enough. Then we got into the implications of this. And here, not only the implications for both for foreign policy and for religious communities. And Bill Vendley, I don't know if Bill has made it yet. He was coming down on the train, but Bill is absolutely superb individual. He heads something called Religions for Peace, which is based in New York. And it's without peer in terms of its connectedness to religious leaders all over the world, the top religious leaders. They really, really cut a wide swath. And then we had basically two targets. First was colleges, universities, and seminaries, out of a strong conviction on my part that it was really the next generation that are going to be able to run with these ideas. Teaching old dogs like me new tricks is just too hard. It really is. And then the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. Our book is rather critical of the Foreign Service. And whenever I made presentations on the book afterwards at State Department or to groups of retired ambassadors and the like, to their credit, they did not get defensive at all. They said, "You're absolutely right, we've had a blind spot." And so they recognized it as well. Our strategy was threefold. One was, I thought, well, if we could put this book out under the auspices of the Center for Strategic International Studies, which had been likened by many journalists, at least, as to the shadow government of the U.S. And this is an outfit that had a long-established reputation for being sort of Cold War mentality, political military approach to life. If you want to resolve conflict, you crush the other side. So we thought that this would give us special resonance with policymakers if we had CSIS auspices. Second was who you get to publish it. And with Oxford University Press, that gives you cachet in academia that's probably second to none. And then finally, just as in terms of general credibility, we went to great lengths to understate the significance of the findings so that no one could ever accuse you of any point along the way of exaggerating, and that worked well. Now, after the book's publication, in the first year alone, we had more than 60 reviews in different newspapers and journals and the like. And the very first one actually was the Washington Post, and these were all very positive reviews. The Financial Times of London gave us a half a page. Washington Times gave us a whole page. At the bottom, you see something that says Sapio from Japan. That's Sapio is Japan's equivalent to Time Magazine, and this was those first ones were all part of that first year. But Sapio was 5 years later. It was in 1999, and what they did is they came out with an article that said the 10 most important books to read in preparing for the 21st century. And Bill, welcome. Your ears should have been burning. I was just talking about you. Bill Vendley has arrived. But I was a little puzzled as to why Japan would get so enthused about a book such as this, because after all, you had sort of 50 years of crass materialism superimposed on Buddhism and Shintoism. And then it quickly became apparent. It's because of their atomic bomb experience and their real dedication to trying to resolve things other than militarily. So that was why I think they felt it was so important. This is the Foreign Affairs Review. It says, this book brings refreshing change. The editor's concluding comments try not to overstate the positive role of religion, but the book brings badly needed balance into the discussion of religion and international affairs. And that was authored by Francis Fukuyama, who was, he's the one, The End of History. I think most of you have heard of that book. And And he saw right through the strategy, though. I mean, that we were trying to not overstate it. Then in terms of response, academia, the book did quickly become required reading in a lot of courses, both the graduate and undergraduate level, in many of the name universities you can think of, and a lot of the ones you can't think of. Foreign Service Institute, it quickly became required reading there in a couple of their courses. Because of the acclaim, we put in place at CSIS a new program, the Preventive Diplomacy Program, and called on Joe Montville to head it up. Joe's a retired Foreign Service officer. He had been part of the steering committee on this book, you know, these lunch conversations I was talking about. And Joe is kind of known for having been the first one to ever coin the term Track 2 diplomacy. And this was in a 1981 article in Foreign Policy magazine. But Joe came in to direct this preventive diplomacy program, did a great job with it. David Steele came on board to be one of the real point of the spear out there in the field, if you will. And the one thing I guess I would say about that, and I chaired it, and we did this for about 5 years, and then one day I told David Steele that I said, you know, we've got a problem here, and I said we need to stay out of the war zones a little bit. And David allowed us how the Lord had laid it on his heart to go in these war zones, and I said, well, David, the Lord has laid it on my heart to have you hold off for a little bit, because what we were doing was training religious clergy and laity in the Balkans while that conflict was taking place. And I could understand, you know, it was the president that took me aside, president of CSIS took me aside, and you know, allowed us how certain board members were getting up, you know, concerned about their fiduciary liabilities with us sending people into war zones, and understandable. So I figured, well, the only way to address that is I've got to leave the think tank and form a do tank. And board members know from day one this is what we do. we go in harm's way. And that's worked out very well, and that led to the establishment of ICRD, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, in 1999. It also had some impact, both immediate and long-term, on the government. In immediate terms, very few people remember this, but before the Commission on International Religious Freedom was, that legislation was approved in the Congress, preceding that, there was a special advisory committee to the Secretary of State. It numbered about 20 folks all told. But because of our book, half of those people were focused on religious reconciliation, while the other half focused on religious freedom. And when the legislation went into effect, then of course the reconciliation piece fell off the table. But more recently, within the last 2 years, there's been established at the State Department an Office for Faith-Based Community Initiatives, which is a long-winded way of saying religious engagement. There's been an office there for religious freedom for quite some time that sadly has been largely marginalized in the past. But now with this new office, it is headed by a gentleman by the name of Sean Casey, who is a professor of Christian ethics at Wesley Seminary here in Washington, and he had been an advisor to Senator Kerry for several years before he became Secretary of State. And so he came into this office, and when Kerry launched this effort, and I was there to see that happen, he made it very clear to the entire State Department that from now on we were going to coordinate with religious leaders overseas on mutually desired objectives. And the one thing that there were no resources to go with the office to speak of, but he had the most critical resource of all, and that was, and the entire department knew it, and he had Kerry's ear. And he's been playing that for all it's worth. I mean, he's just doing a super job. I can't say enough good about the job he's doing there. Very well suited for it. Now, that part was a large part of what that last book, Religion, Terror, and Error, the subtitle of that is U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement. And it really was focused on how how to incorporate religion into the practice of U.S. foreign policy, how to move beyond the rational actor model of decision-making to accommodate non-rational factors like religion and non-state actors, and then finally how to move to a new leadership paradigm that would serve the United States better in the years ahead. But the establishment of this office, I would call it, even though it's doing as great a job as it can, it's really a Band-Aid solution to something that really requires major surgery. And I think slowly but surely we're seeing state come around to not only understanding the significance of it, but actually supporting it. They've been actively supporting our work in Syria, which has led to some good things despite the travails prevailing in that region. Other things along the way, at one point, this was in 2001, this is before 9/11, but the Chief of Navy Chaplains engaged me to lead a team of 4 people in training all Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard chaplains in religion and statecraft. And the Navy bought all 1,300 of them a copy of this book, which didn't hurt book sales at all. And so we went all over the world doing this. And these, there were about 4-day-long training sessions, and Joe Montville was part of it. Don Shriver from Union Theological Seminary was another one, and the final team member was Dick Ruffin. Dick, are you here? I knew. Yeah, okay, yeah. And as far as I was concerned, even though I was leading it, I thought Dick was the star of the show. So you have to act modest, Dick. But that was a fun time. And as you might imagine, about a third of all the chaplains, they were very enthused about it. Another third were quite willing to give it a try, and another third is, that's not why I signed up, so you have to have a heart for it. Secondly, another one, there's so many things that happened as a result of this book, but another one was I got invited by our embassy to the Holy See in Rome to come over and meet with the Vatican Foreign Service for about a week in Rome. And I went over there and I thought, what in the world can I teach the Vatican Foreign Service? Well, it didn't take me long to figure it out, because all of these folks were still, the last thing they had to talk about or to lay claim to was their resolving the Channel Islands dispute between Chile and Argentina way back in the 1970s. And the whole idea was to expand their horizons, to get them to think more creatively and expansively and do a lot of good that needs doing out there. So those are just some asides, if you will. Outreach, more speaking engagements that I can count, but these are some of the universities that have, that incorporated the book and had me come talk about it and that sort of thing. And then we had the more practitioner side of the house, the Foreign Service Institute, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, just state, all the rest of it. So as Eric was suggesting, the book really had an impact. It was the first one out there that had systematically looked at the potential. This concept is so simple as to be profound, trying to use religion for good. I mean, whoever heard of such a thing? So anyway, we formed the center, and this is our mission statement up here, and what we went after is these identity-based conflicts. After the Cold War disappeared, all these long suppressed antagonisms came to the fore. And I didn't know that the Berlin Wall was going to come down when it did, but the fact that it did made all of a sudden made what the book was talking about so relevant. And people everywhere saw that this potential for marrying religious reconciliation with official or unofficial diplomacy had more promise for these kinds of conflicts that typically exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy, whether it's ethnic conflict, tribal warfare, religious hostilities, what have you. So that's kind of why we were formed. And our criteria for engaging in different places, we want to do the most good for the most people. But second was where there are relationships of trust with some of the principles involved in the conflict to which we had access. That was a very, very big consideration. Third was that it be of strategic consequence to the United States. And the reason for that was that I thought that this, our number one strategic goal at ICRD when we were created was to facilitate the incorporation of religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. So we felt that the best way to go at that is if they could see us involved in doing important things in areas that they cared very much about, they'd start to wake up, and that kind of is what happened. Finally, we try, because we're so small and we like to have a value-added impact, we try to go where others aren't, and we generally stuck to that, except we are in the Middle East, and there's 400 other NGOs in the Middle East, and the only reason we're there is because our senior vice president, who's an Episcopal rector out in Santa Barbara, California, called me one day and said the Lord had laid it on his heart to, and who am I to quarrel? So there we are. But we're up to our ears in Syria right now and doing some good things. We were able to, with State Department support, we were able to facilitate a social contract between the Syriac Christians, the Kurds, and the Arab Bedouin tribal leaders in the Al-Hasaq region. That's the eastern region of Syria, where ISIS is very prominent at this point. And we've just received the funding to go ahead and implement that social contract. But what it will do is will enable those folks who have not always lived in peace to do so once the fighting subsides. So with those as criteria, you can see where we've been engaged. We started in Sudan, and we went to Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Colombia, United States. And what we're doing in the United States is about every month and a half, we'll have a meeting on Capitol Hill where we bring together key executive branch staff and key congressional staff and selected American Muslim leaders and folks from the American Muslim community and outside experts. And nobody makes a presentation. It always starts out with one of the policy types sharing the problems that they're wrestling with. And then this segues into an hour and a half of very rich discussion. And we all come away, myself included, with a much deeper understanding of what's going on. And the whole idea why we're doing that is to try to impart to our policy process a more nuanced understanding of Islam. Back in the Cold War, we used to always put on a Soviet hat and look at the problem from their perspective. None of that's happened here, and so we're trying to kind of accomplish that in new ways. Our flagship projects, one that we were involved for 7 years in Pakistan, on the ground, reforming the madrasas. These are religious schools, including the ones that gave birth to the Taliban, and had quite a lot of success with that. Engaged some 2,700 madrasa leaders from 1,600 different madrasas. But at about that time, the extremists really started to target us. We were the subject of a 7-page online jihadist journal article that went to all the cells in Pakistan and Afghanistan, specifically targeting our work. And they had us down cold. I mean, they accused us of, quote, venomous concepts like tolerance, moderation, women's empowerment. You just go on, and all of which were deemed to be caustic to Islamic family values. Fortunately, 2 years earlier, we'd put in place the legal framework for an indigenous NGO that we would one day staff up and pass the baton to, because our job is always to work ourselves out of a job by creating capacity, not dependency. So we did that. We staffed it up. We let our project director go, who was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It's the only adjective I can think to describe him. And his efforts, 90% of our success was due to his efforts. But we let him go, and he became the president of that indigenous NGO. They haven't missed a beat. That 2,700 and 1,600 number I gave you is now up to 4,500 and 2,500. So it's really going on, and they've just put together a book on peacemaking that was requested by the head of the Deobandi sect, which is that's the hardest line sect and more powerful by far than any of the others in Pakistan. And that's going to go into all of the madrasas now. and we've established teacher training institutes to train people in that. And quite honestly, you know, this really is the strategic piece in that larger mosaic. For about 5 years, our own embassy in Islamabad was not supportive of our work, not only not financially, but just not even morally, and never could figure out whether it was a problem of church and state, or if it was, you know, just politically too hot to handle the fact that Americans were messing around with Pakistani religious schools. But for whatever reason, after 5 years, and just about the time we were shifting to indigenous, a contingent came over from state, and they said, we want to build our strategy around your work. Because they woke up to the fact that, you know, what we were doing with the madrasas, dealing with the ideas behind the guns, is the right way to drain the swamp of extremism. Bombs and bullets have their place, but that's not the way to drain the swamp. It just begets more terrorists. And what you find is that when you win hearts and minds, it gets contagious, and it works. So this, you know, this is one piece, and it will take time, but we're going now. We have one more listed there called Jihadi Salafism, and this is something we've just raised the funding for a pilot project in Pakistan, but we're going to expand that to 8 more countries, Muslim countries. We're going to look very hard at the approaches that governments and civil society have taken to counter the impact of jihadi Salafism and the violence and instability that accompanies it. And we want to look at all of those different approaches. We want to determine, you know, what makes the most sense, what is the best strategy for us to follow. And as far as our center is concerned, foremost to us is we want to look at the nonviolent strains of Salafism to see how they might be called into action to marginalize, if not totally counter, the violent strains. So that's aspirations. You were talking about the future. That's one of the things we think is very, very important, Eric, is to get a handle on this. Right now, the average American will read his newspaper in the morning and he'll see that there's, you know, the extremists are up to no good in Djibouti. Well, he's lucky if he can spell Djibouti, let alone know where it is. You know, we just know there's bad things going on out there, you know. But nobody's done a systematic analysis of exactly, you know, how that's happening and what's being done about it. So we hope to be able to contribute on that front in addition to any number of others. Of those listed, Yemen is also prospective. We just received the funding for Yemen, so we're going to be going into there. And so I think at this point I would just like to, you know, a lot of people are asking, you know, what about ISIS or ISIL, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, sadly there's no magic bullets at this point. What you find is that religious leaders can have great impact before conflict breaks out and in the post-conflict reconciliation. But once the toothpaste is out of the tube and conflict has erupted, nobody pays much attention to them. And we have some wonderfully placed important religious leaders in Pakistan speaking out loudly and all over the place about what's going on in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, and totally against it, but doesn't matter. You know, they're doing their thing, and so we will continue to try to be on the preventive side of things. Our work in Saudi Arabia, I think, has been very encouraging. I see the Saudis making a huge change underway. I don't know that any of it's driven by Western criticism. We chose to not be critics, but to try to give them credit for what they've done, but be unsparing in our detail of what yet needs to be done in terms of educational reform. Again, that strategic piece, if you will. And their reform effort, which was funded at $1.5 billion, has just been escalated to $22 billion, and it's going to go higher. That's a lot of money. And they've developed a strategic plan. They understand that textbooks are just a small part of the problem. Training your instructors is far more important, these sorts of things. So there's, the winds of change are blowing. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take a lot of patience on our part, and in the meantime, figure out what to do about the more threatening aspects of outfits like ISIS. But let me just sort of draw it to a conclusion there and ask if either Bill or David would like to just say a few words, and then we'll open it for questions and answers if that's okay. Bill, would you like to? Bill Vendley, yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, Doug, thank you. I guess I'm Bill Vendley. I'm the Secretary General of a group known as Religions for Peace, and I was privileged to join Doug and the other colleagues on this effort. Doug, I think your presentation was extremely helpful, and we can chart in some ways the changes going on in governments, our own, but I'll be in Japan in 2 weeks speaking to a group of bi-party Japanese diplomats, members of parliament, about the Japanese government's own taking religion seriously as part of their own strategy. So this is contagious, and I think I heard you say your book, of course, the book is in Japanese, and many of those know it. So I think what you have chronicled here in the United States is important. My contribution is that it's happening now in other states. They're observing what's happened here with this government. What's happening with our government has been impacted by this effort. There's no question in my mind about it. The other vector, however, is to say what's happening on the religious community side. They weren't built to be statecraft actors in the first instance. And so the other side of the equation is that all around the world, the religious communities are learning how to become partners with states in terms of value-based shared agenda. And that's translated to the religious communities around the world beginning to gear up and train themselves so that they can have the requisite skills to engage in these government track 2 partnerships. So I think, Doug, that's the other side of the work that we could also chronicle. The incredible impact this has had on religious communities all over the world. It shows in the ever more common willingness of the religious communities to recognize they have a stake in what heretofore states have regarded as their major prerogative. So that's just a small comment, but I could document this with abundant richness from country after country after country, engaged not only in areas of diplomacy dealing with conflict or conflict resolution or reconciliation, but once the formula that we were struggling for in the book is brought into focus, if you look in the early throughout the book, there's a struggle to say what would be the roles of the religious communities. Once that has been asked at a sufficient level of depth, the question then becomes, you can generalize that question. And the problems, and this may seem like it's very far afield, but the big problems that we've seen over the last decades, the HIV/AIDS crisis and so forth, those kinds of problems that we call development problems, we began to say, well, again, the same formulas we're applying. What's the problem? How would we drive that problem analysis into a needed set of roles? And then we'd ask ourselves the next question, well, what are the capacities that the religious communities have for those roles? And so that's a kind of re-inventorying, if you will, of the religious communities per the needed set of public roles, whether they're in conflict resolution, reconciliation, today the environmental crisis. Maybe the way to generalize it, Doug, is how are the religious communities becoming public actors in relationship with the states, and more states recognizing they need to work in that public partnership. So I learned a terrific amount by being part of this enterprise, and I was thrilled to be able to personally come back this afternoon and to acknowledge the gratitude to Doug personally, but to all the people on his team.
Well, Bill, thank you for making the trek down from New York to do this, but thank you more importantly for all the great work that you and Religions for Peace are doing. We take great pride in the many, many accomplishments of your organization. I could not hold it in higher regard, believe me, and that has a lot to do with the leadership. David, do you have a few words you'd like to say?
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being able to be here. Doug said he came to this work never having taken a course in religion. I came as a former pastor and theologian, never having taken a course in international relations. I was just completing a PhD, actually, in Christian social ethics and practical theology. Had done research in East and West Berlin at the time that the wall was coming down. And so I was invited to write the chapter on East Germany. Doug says the events there actually precipitated a turnaround on the part of the State Department. What's probably not well known is how much the churches played a critical, absolutely critical role in that happening. That's what I was writing on in that chapter. I'd like to also affirm a number of things that both Bill and Doug have been commenting on. One is the way in which all of this has then been assumed on the part of, as an agenda by governments, not only our own, but in 2006 I was invited by the Foreign Ministry of the Dutch government to help lead a process of examination of the way in which they might be involved in faith-based peace building. Just one small example. Looking at your comment, Bill, about the need for faith communities around the world also to assume a role that, as you said, is difficult finding. Many examples back 20 years ago. Today you look around and you find multiple examples. I teach at Brandeis University now, and one of the courses I teach is on religion and conflict and identity, looking at both the positive and negative aspects of that. And you can draw on examples of all different traditions all around the world. I think one thing I'd like to challenge a little bit in what you were saying, Doug, is whether or not this role is only at the point of pre and post. I think the roles are different, in fact, at different stages. I deal a lot with looking at, for example, a radical extremist religion today. And one of the real problems that I see in terms of how religious communities locally can have impact is that if those radical groups that really have tremendous impact, they have to build linkages and networks with their wider faith tradition within the areas in which they live and operate. How do you begin either to prevent that or to transform those linkages? That's something I think you can begin to do at any stage. It's different kinds of roles at different points, but I've seen it happen, where how do local people in whatever tradition it might be begin to deal with the ideological problems? How do they begin to relate to the relational issues, which they know far better than any outsiders do? The local religious people, on both local level and national, have far better access, they have far better knowledge. They may need to be equipped in some ways, but they become a tremendous resource, as Bill has just outlined. I've seen that happen as I worked on just about every continent in the world at this point. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, David. And I take your point on that. The other thing I would just say is that when we opened the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, not having had a course in religion nor spending 1 minute as a diplomat in my life, that was buttressed by the insights from folks like Joe Montville on the diplomacy side, like David on the religion side, but I would not denigrate the crucial role that my background in political military had in this, because the reality is if we'd had somebody trying to get something like this off the ground that came out of the peace community, the church community, or conflict resolution field, would have never gotten off the ground. It's because, it's the political military arena where all the life and death decisions are made. And if you can traverse that minefield, I think you can make just about anything work, So now I think that collectively we have proven this concept sufficient that folks who do come out of those fields I just mentioned can take over. And one of the great joys to me is the 3 years ago attracting a gent who's our executive vice president who does come out of those fields, and he's as good as it gets, James Patton. So it's a great honor to be able to work with him and to learn from him as well. Anyway, I think we're at the question and answer point right now, so we'll take your questions. Thank you.
You had mentioned Joe and your involvement with the advisory board. Joe, do you want to make a comment, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group? There's a microphone coming.
Thanks. I'll give you one example of the application of all this learning that Doug has been describing, and Bill also, and David. I'm a Middle East specialist, and it's my mother conflict. And I've been working on a project called Toward the Abrahamic Family Reunion. It's a symbol sort of built on the reunion of Isaac and Ishmael in Hebron, who come together to bury their father Abraham. It's designed to be a very naked exploitation of the emotion that comes from alienated brothers who come back to bury their father. The idea is that so much of the Middle East conflict is based on symbols, but also historical experience of world Jewry, and especially European Jewry, and Islam. And I've been doing a lot of studying of both traditions, and in fact, I'll take this opportunity to mention that on October 26th, Sunday, at the School for International Service at American University, I'll be giving an endowed talk on this subject, on the Jewish-Christian relationship and unfinished business. Everyone's invited. There's going to be a good buffet and lots of wine for people who don't care about the fixing the Jewish-Christian relationship. Anyway, Washington Theological Consortium, if anybody's interested, just go online and you'll get you can RSVP. But I'm working there and I've established a project at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, where I'm bringing all of this experience with Doug and David and a collegial relationship with Bill into a program called Healing Historical Memory, because I've become a political psychologist for my sins. And healing memory and dealing with the psychology of victimhood is one of the greatest tasks in analysis and peace building. And the Christian-Jewish relationship is far from healed based on the experience of being Jewish in Christian Europe. And yet there's a tremendous history of Jewish-Muslim creative coexistence that doesn't have a chance to make it through the black cloud of the conflict. So those are just a few dimensions of how this applied work from a retired diplomat gets done.
Wonderful. Well, let me say something about the next 15 minutes or so. We have a reception downstairs that we're going to adjourn to in about 15 minutes, and we'll continue the conversation there. But we'll take some Q&A now from the audience. And I'm going to privilege students. So if you look like a student to me and your hand goes up, I'm going to start there. You've heard from, I think he called himself, I think he said Old Dog. And so you've heard from those who were participants in the project 20 years ago. And of course, we'll take questions from whoever on the floor. But when I call on you, would you identify yourself and tell us your affiliation? Wait for the microphone, and we'll go from there. Okay. What was a question or comment? Well, we have a quick hand right there, and you look like a young student, ma'am. So would you start us out?
Well, I didn't come as far as Bill, and I'm not such a young student. Came from Philadelphia Dialogue Institute. We've been together a lot, Doug and myself, in Macedonia and in other conflicts and situations. I come out of the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. And right now we're bringing in Viad Dakil from the Yazidi community, the only Yazidi in Iraqi parliament. And I do want to agree with you, David, that there's got to be some kind of response during a conflict, if not from the people from within, then the people from without. And what's happening to the Yazidi, as well as the Kurdish community, is something that is right now, with all the genocides and all the other major conflicts where we know that there is a victim and is a victimized group, and particularly religious, ethnic, but definitely religious community, there's something that I really need to work with you much more, Douglas, on this and in the statecraft community of how our responses are from religious communities around, let alone also the Christian community there. The second issue that I hope that you will think about in a larger way is the issue of women. The status of women and the role of religion and state in both cases is something that I know that you can't handle everything, but I really would hope that you would, in your senior position and in your special place where you're standing, be able to encourage a lot more of that kind of conversation, as difficult as it is. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just respond to that in reverse order. On the women's side, I'll just give you an example. I said our flagship project for 7 years was the the Madras Reform. And when we started that, the female leaders of girls' madrasas wanted us to do for them what we were doing for the males. But the males would not hear of it, so we didn't. But 3 years later, I guess the women worked on them for a while, the males asked us to do them. So as you might expect, the women get it twice as fast. And I'll never forget one of the quotes. This is a poor paraphrase, but it was from one woman who said, you know, you can work with the male madrasas till the cows come home, but if you want change, talk to us. We control them. And I thought, you know, some things are the same the world over. You know, it's just, but one of the great things about being an NGO, as Bill and others here know, is that you can do the right thing for the right reason at the right time. You don't have to worry about the politics. But you need to be able to raise the money to do it, okay? So when we first started our work in Syria, we had a game plan to prevent a civil war there. And we were using one of the important instruments that we have at our disposal called faith-based reconciliation seminars, where you bring folks together and you capitalize on the transcendent aspects of their personal religious faith in overcoming the secular obstacles to peace. And these sessions always end with people, some of whom have been bitter protagonists, hugging, tears. I mean, it touches hearts, not just minds. And so we started this, and the first two of these we had to raise the money privately. And it took an egregious long time to do that. Then state came in, they saw the wisdom of it, and they funded the next three. But that stretched out over, it took us 2 years to what needed to be done in 6 months, you know, and we could have, the prevention ended up being, you know, now it's just, we're in the middle of it, okay? And your point's well taken, Dave. I mean, you still do all you can. But where it's going to really apply, I think most effectively at this point will be in the post-conflict reconciliation. But anyway, I take your point and thank you for making it.
Thanks. Right here.
Hi, my name is
Another student.
Another student, yes, exactly. We're always students, I hope. My name is Walt Grazer, and I worked with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops for 26 years, and I'm trying to work with Tom Banshoff, who's here at the center, to try to see if we can set up a project on religion and environment. My question has to do with kind of the culture and getting the kind of an institutional apparatus with the U.S. government. So, you know, you'd mentioned the weak International Office for Religious Freedom and so forth. Sean's doing a good job, but a lot of that's dependent on Kerry. You could get a new Secretary of State and so on. So the question is, how do you get this into the culture of like the U.S. diplomacy so that it becomes much more vigorous and religion's taken much more seriously and not just, oh my God, they're just a problem?
You know, it's a great question, and it's a question that we respond to directly in that last book, you know, Religion, Terror, and Error. And one of the things that we call for there, and this is something that doesn't get uniform support across the board from very thoughtful people, but I'm convinced, you know, you need to realign the executive branch, basically. And we give 4 alternative structures on how the State Department should be structured to be able to consider religious factors on a daily basis in the normal course of business, okay? But one of the ingredients in there is, you know, I think we need to establish a new position in the Foreign Service called Religion Attaché. And you would only post these in missions overseas in countries where religion has particular salience, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Israel or where have you. We looked hard at the globe and came to the conclusion that a cadre of 30 of these folks could handle our global interests. And what it would do, you know, a lot of people will say, well, the greatest way to marginalize something and make it ineffective is to create a specialist. Well, not necessarily. You know, I think that if you had a religion attaché and you treated it the same way you do your political military officers, and they're part of the political section of the embassy, they could be right at the heart of it, and it would equip you to deal with these very complex religious issues, which typically, if they're addressed at all now, they're addressed by the cultural affairs officer, the political officer, or the ambassador, him or herself. but all too often they get pushed aside by more pressing business, if you will. They're just too hard to deal with. And you need folks who have been trained well and who understand how faith inspires action and can deal with it, And so we, like I said, this is just a Band-Aid, Sean's office, frankly, as good as he's doing. You need to penetrate the regional bureaus. You need to, you need to penetrate the embassies where this stuff really matters. And it's doable. We concluded that cadre of 30 would cost us $10 million a year. Sounds like a lot of money, but compared to the billions we spend on symptoms like baggage handlers and all the rest of it, it's nothing. It's peanuts to be able to deal with cause. Got to get at the cause. So I'm totally in agreement with you.
Yeah. There in the back.
I'm John Tilson. I'm a recently retired Department of Defense employee, and I have to tell you that I have watched for many years the Department of Defense totally failed to recognize religious motivations of the people that they were out there trying to kill. And so I applaud your efforts, but I wonder if, and I was particularly impressed when I saw President Obama's speech in the UN when he talked about the need to achieve reconciliation between religious groups, and particularly between Shias and Sunnis. And I wonder if you think that this is a beginning of a recognition or a change in the U.S. government writ large, maybe even ultimately in the Department of Defense, to actually address these religious issues.
Well, I think the Department of Defense woke up earlier than the State Department, quite frankly. And one of the things I've found, I've been sort of struck by the double standard that we use because one of the problems that's out there is the political ambiguity surrounding our separation of church and state, leads to paralysis. It intimidates our political and military leaders from dealing with the religious dimension of the threats that they're facing. That's all a part of it. And that could be easily rectified. It wouldn't take much at all. And simply have the president task his Justice Department to come up with the policy brief for why religious engagement should be considered a component of U.S. foreign policy, and then get high-level bipartisan support on the Hill. And then you're off and running. You unleash the creative energies of all these folks. But one person who got it, who understood all this, was David Petraeus. General Petraeus, when he would brief the Congress on his briefing chart, engage religious leaders, And what you find is that the Department of Defense is able to go in there and repair mosques and do all that sort of thing to create local goodwill, and they do a lot of it. But whenever the civilian side, AID, tries to do it, they get shut down by the lawyers right away. But the military chaplains back at this point, it must be at least 5 years ago. This was a real milestone, but something called Joint Publication 105 laid out this kind of the rules of engagement for military chaplains that enables them to really get into these, to be a point of the spear, if you will, in dealing with this. One of the things in history, I'm sorry to be rambling all over, but even the French, the authors of secularism, when they got into tight situations, when they were fighting the Muslim rebels in Algeria, whenever they get in a tight situation, it was their military chaplains they sent out to negotiate with the Muslim. And so they understood it, and they were a lot quicker to put in an office on foreign policy in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs long before we did. So we can learn from others, but I think we are learning ourselves as we go, and we can't cede the field. I'm not an apologist for our current stance, but one of the contributing factors is in the wake of World War II, the overriding challenge was to contain the godless Soviet Union, right? So religion wasn't at the table. I don't know if it's ever been at the table, but it certainly wasn't in that context. And then when that went away, of course, now we're left with all these things that have been suppressed for a long, long time.
In the back there.
Hi, my name is Monica Dorhai, and I'm a professor, and I work in the Middle East for about 7 years. And I work on international aid. I'm a banker. I'm a risk specialist for them. So with me, you're not supposed to lose the money. And if I see a problem, we are likely to lose the money. I worked on the side of World Bank. The advantage is we never lose the money. We never lose. UN does, because we use the risk specialist. However, I'm a PhD, although I'm a banker, I'm a PhD in political science. And they were very, very careful when I worked in Iraq. I was on the south with the Brits, but I was not in combat. I'm a banker. I can stay in Washington. I can stay in Amman. I can go in. I also work in the north. I work in Yemen. I worked on Pakistan, Afghanistan. I work on natural disaster emergency, rapid response. Your work should be and is seen as I look at it as a banker. I just attended the annual meetings, and the annual meetings are about, of course, developmental organization, but it's also J.P. Morgan, the biggest banks were here. So what I really think of, if you would present this book and this topic to them, what is it that they should care about? It's hard to convince them that in their work you should take into account this.
I didn't totally hear everything, but I think that you were suggesting that we make the opportunity available to the banking industry to get behind this sort of thing, to promote stability and.
Why should say the IMF care? Why should the World Bank care about the religious dimension?
Yeah. Well, they should care. And there was an attempt made at the World Bank when Catherine Marshall was over there under Jim Wolfenson, who was the head of the World Bank at the time, and he understood clearly why religion was such an important ingredient in the mix of being able to succeed at what they were doing. They just needed to be informed, and they needed to understand it, and they needed to be able to work with it. But they just spun their wheels, and the bureaucracy wore them down. They had no impact to really speak of. And one of the things I might just say too, that in the United States, for example, we have very little support from religious organizations, because the metric they use is more like how many souls have you saved this quarter, as opposed to how many relationships should be reconciled. But when you talk about corporate and government, when they hear the word religion, they run for the hills. Everybody's afraid to deal. They're afraid of being accused of favoring one religious tradition over another. So I have thought that we could appeal to industry, to corporations, and show how this contributes to stability, which helps their bottom line, but haven't had much success in that. They don't see it as direct to their bottom line as I think it really is. So we're constantly fighting the fight. We've been hanging by our fingernails financially ever since we established ourselves in 1999. But I do feel good about the change I see, slow though it be, with the government. I wish the private sector could really get behind us, but truly there are some obstacles there. I didn't answer your IMF question, but I think it's the same thing as the World Bank response, frankly.
Well, I see that there's a number of hands. We're going to take one last question, and then we'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Another student.
Yes, well, as a matter of fact, I just started to take Spanish, so I really am. My name's Roger Moran. I'm an attorney and a retired Foreign Service officer. I was a political officer, and I also served as a political military officer. And I'm very much an admirer of your work. And I must say, even back in the 80s, I was taught at the Foreign Service Institute that religion was part of my brief. It needed to be followed. But I have to agree that it only gets followed to the extent that it's a matter of individual interest on the part of the Foreign Service officer concerned, or further up in his chain within the embassy. The annual report on international religious freedom institutionalized a bit of this interest in religion, but it's been there. I must say, over the course of my career, which was almost all in sub-Saharan Africa, half a dozen different countries, I always made a point of going out to meet religious leaders, to know them, to talk to them, and also to members of, for example, the Vatican's diplomatic corps. So it's out there. And what do Foreign Service officers, political officers do? We write cables. You write reports. So it's reports on the situation of religion in a given country, on its role in the politics of that country. Yes, it depends on the place, and I don't think that the way to do it, however, is having religious attachés. They will be so marginalized. They will have no career path. And I would take as an example, I think there's still science attachés. And, you know, they do great work, but it's a dead end for a lot of people. And I would just argue for greater integration into the generalized work of the Foreign Service of the role of religion in the societies that we report on and try to influence. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you make a point that is widely shared with a lot of other Foreign Service officers, but quite frankly, the obstacles you cite with respect to a religion attaché don't have to exist. You don't have to necessarily take career Foreign Service officers to accomplish the task. You can have it contracted in. You can do it any number of ways. And you can integrate it into the process, like I was saying, you know, in the political section, where it's part and parcel of doing business, just like, as you said, the political military. One of the things I would just add on this is that, you know, in Pakistan, the reason we succeeded with the madrasas, where nobody else has, least of all the government of Pakistan, was there were several reasons. There were 4 reasons, actually. First was ownership. We did it in such a way that the madrasa leaders felt it was their reform effort, which meant they had a lot of ownership of the change process, and they came up with good ideas. Second was inspiring them with their own heritage, you know, not only of their schools themselves, which were once without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world in the Middle Ages, but back to the early days of Islam, when the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences, including religious tolerance, took place under Islam. Third, probably most important, was we grounded all suggested change in Islamic principles so they could feel they were becoming better Muslims in the process. Fourth, though, this is the one I wanted to get to, which I don't mention it very often, but it blows them away whenever I do, but we operate from a posture of total humility because we're very mindful of the fact that the United States was very complicit in planting the seeds of jihad in the madrasas in the first place. We wanted to grow holy warriors to evict the godless Soviets out of Afghanistan. So what happens? Soviets leave, we leave, now we come back. The madrasas are doing what we trained them to do. They've just changed targets. So this is one more instance of far too many instances of falling victim to the law of unintended consequences. And we just need to be able to think beyond the curve, and we need to understand the religious dynamics as we do so. And I totally agree with you. We ought to integrate this kind of training into the Foreign Service more broadly, and some of that's going on. I mean, that's not falling on deaf ears. But I still continue to think it is so important. It's far more important than a science or a commercial attaché, for example. We just have to be willing to step up to the plate, I think. Anyway, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Well, before we leave, let me mention on behalf of the Berkley Center 3 resources that you could take with you from here, and they're all available on our website. It's berkleycenter.georgetown.edu. Some of you asked about the religious freedom components, and we have a robust religious freedom project here And there's an entire suite of books and knowledge resources that you can download for free. That project's led by Tom Farr. Second is religion and development. And there's more than 30 project studies available on our website on issues of women, on development, on disease, on corruption, and how those things intersect with faith. And Catherine Marshall, who was mentioned earlier, formerly at the World Bank, leads that project. All of those things are available to you. And then there's a third sector, and that is religion, war, and peace. I led that when I was here full-time, and those resources are still there and being augmented. These are case studies on some of the things like Doug talked about today, where religious peacemakers have made a difference. There's a set of film guides that are appropriate for classroom use. There's a variety of other resources on this topic, and all of those things are available at the Berkley Center website. Well, we're going to adjourn downstairs for a reception. Would you help me in congratulating Doug for this wonderful book?